Today on FlyWire, I want to talk about a fatal crash just after takeoff of the Cessna Cardinal in October 2023. This is a tough one, so stick with me on FlyWire. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and the NTSB prelim report is out on 545 Papa Zulu, and today I want to talk about that fatal crash of the 177RG Cardinal, in which Richard McSpadden and NFL football legend Russ Francis perished. There are a lot of things that we don't know, but there are some lessons that we can learn from the prelim and lessons that I think could save your life one day. I know I think about it. First off, I may be a heretic in that I really don't care why the engine failed or what went wrong with it to give it partial power. It plainly wasn't producing full power for some reason. And I would hazard a guess that it wasn't a novel failure. Frankly, it just doesn't matter to me. What is important is what you do as the pilot after the failure. Your actions right now are the most important test in your life. I've done several videos on this impossible turn-back maneuver for the engine failure after takeoff, and I'll leave links below if you'd like to review them. I knew Richard, and we had talked a couple of times about the subject after the video, about the turnback subject after the video I did on the B-36 turnback crash at Pembroke Pines, Florida. After the AOPA Air Safety Foundation did the comparison at EFTO turnback video, then on takeoff, I talked with him again, disagreeing with his approach. I thought it was, in my view, a bit reckless. What is important about that disagreement is what is important about in this accident to highlight. Richard was a proponent of the turnback, and it works in his Super Cub. In fact, it works in my Husky. I can easily make it back at 500 feet, maybe a little less, though 200, 300 feet AGL, a successful turnback is in serious doubt. I did a video on this in the Husky, by the way, and I'll also leave a link below for that. The critical difference between airplanes is wing loading. A light Super Cub or a Husky is a completely different animal than a heavy Bonanza, or in this case, a Cardinal. Keep wing loading in mind as we go through this prelim report. Not all airplanes are created equal. The flight was operated as a Part 91 aerial photography flight, the Cardinal being the subject airplane, and the A-36 being the photo ship. I've done hundreds of these photo missions, photo flights, both in the subject airplane and also as the flying the photo ship, and I'm fine from doing it from the right seat. I usually let the owner do the takeoff and the landing, but I don't ever let them fly any of the formation work, and I suspect that this is exactly what McSpadden was doing on the 1st of October 2023. It was a pretty day. The nearest weather reporting station was at the Adirondack Regional 13 miles northwest, and they were reporting winds of 010 at 7, 10 miles viz, clear skies, and about 74 degrees. A curious thing happened just before takeoff of this flight. The engine was shut down on the Cardinal and then restarted 10 seconds later. We don't know the significance of that. A problem with the engine, a restart, reset, just don't know. A witness of the takeoff roll reported that the engine sounded as if it was in climb power, and then he heard an engine surge, as if perhaps it went to full RPM. He further stated that it did not sound as if it was making full power during the initial climb. Interesting point. The accident airplane made a gentle left turn between 300 and 400 feet above the ground to join with the A-36 photo ship. When the accident airplane close to about 1,000 feet of the A-36, it suddenly made a hard right turn back towards the departure airport. During the turn, the pilot of the A-36 reported hearing the passenger from the Cardinal transmit on the common frequency, "We have a problem and we're returning to the airport." The Cardinal subsequently impacted the embankment just prior to the airport ground level and a right-wing nose-low attitude about 15 feet below the top of the plateau. The airplane then slid down the embankment for about 30 feet and coming to a rest upright with the left wing oriented pretty much upslope, and the slope angle was reported to be about 70 degrees. Pretty steep little embankment, and the initial impact was 440 feet from the approach end of runway 14 and which is the opposite direction of takeoff, as you would imagine, and they took off on 3-2, and approximately 250 feet left of center line. Okay, so not lined up with the runway. The NTSB listed obstructions on the runway 14 end as 70-foot high trees located 884 feet from the runway, 334 feet left of center line, so there are no trees really to impact at that point. There were two roads, 45 and 145 feet from the threshold, and 12-foot high trees 93 feet from the runway and 132 feet right of center line. The NTSB examined the wreckage at the site. They observed that the right wing had buckled from the tip to the aileron flap junction, and the fuselage was slightly buckled aft of the right cabin door just short of the empennage. This is consistent with the impact and the rotation. Still momentum is in the turn. Control cable continuity was established. The flaps were extended to 10 degrees, and the trim, stabilizer trim, was neutral. That's an important point there as far as making the turn and maintaining speed. The fuel system had fuel. The vents were not obstructed, and no blockages were observed. They did drain 17 gallons from the right tank. The first responders noted fuel draining from the airplane on their arrival. There appeared to be any water contamination in the fuel that was left aboard. They tested it. The nose gear was crushed aft during the impact, and the main landing gear were in an intermediate position. They were not in the wheel wells. The engine had 36.7 hours since major overhaul at the last annual, which was in April. Don't know how many hours it had flown in the intervening months, 6 months. But on examining the engine, the investigator found the mixture control was full rich, and the fuselage as well. Mixture control full rich, power control was in fine high RPM, and the throttle was about 2 inches out and bent up and left about 30 degrees. The engine remained attached to the firewall, but various tubes of the engine mount were damaged and showed the bending, and it was canted right of aircraft center line, consistent with that motion. As the nose stopped this way, the airplane continued to rotate, and it's that impact damage. It was off center. The propeller remained attached to the crankshaft with one blade partially dislodged from the hub, the blade exhibiting leading edge scratches and gouges. The other blade was bent slightly at midspan with an approximate 2-inch section of the tip curled and separated. That blade also exhibited chordwise scratching and leading edge gouges on the outer 1/3 of the balloon. The rest of the engine and the accessories were examined, and no defects noted and could not be attributed to impact damage, with one possible exception. The threaded rod for the idle thumb screw was found fractured and not connected. It is unclear if there was any other damage to any nearby components in the engine bay that could have caused that fracture and disconnection. It's possible that this may be an issue related to the accident sequence in the original failure mode, or it may not. There's just more that needs to be answered in the final report. I've got to compliment the NTSB investigator on this one. They did a thorough job documenting in the accident site and writing at the prelim report. It's much better than most I've found, so good on you. There's a lot to go on here as far as evidence to determine the accident sequence, and it's as a result of that. Several things jump out at me from reading this report. The first one is that the engine was producing power on impact. You could tell that by the damage specifics on the propeller blades. What we do not know is how much power. Given the low energy state of the landing profile, though, I would say this was definitely a partial power situation and not enough power to even maintain level flight. Couple that with the throttle being not quite fully in and bent up and left, I think that could possibly be consistent with a throttle obstruction and subsequent attempt to obtain full throttle by the pilot by force. Again, investigating any other possible damage causes would have to be done before concluding this was a factor, both in the engine compartment and in the cabin as well. It appears that the airplane was in a right turn back towards the runway on impact, as evidenced by the damage on the right wing and the engine, the nose bowl. Some rotation of the airplane from the turning momentum, coupled with the slope of the embankment, caused the airplane to continue to rotate right as it slid down the hill, stopping with the left wing pointing upslope. as I noted earlier. The majority of the energy dissipation that occurred was on that initial impact. Little other damage to the airplane evinced any other damage sequence. As I mentioned before, during photo missions I've done, I don't let the owner of the airplane fly any of the formation event. Witnesses say the airplane made a general left turn to the left to start the rejoin, but given the impact point was about 250 feet left of center line, I would say that the airplane had not completed its turn from the rejoin here to return to the runway. So it was still pretty far. They were not far from the extended center line, is what I'm trying to say. So that's when the crew decided to turn back pretty early, so they hadn't gotten very far. Otherwise, the geometry would have worked out a little better. It is impossible to determine who was flying the airplane at this point, and to be purely clinical about it, and an autopsy discovery of broken wrist would show who was probably flying on impact. But in the end, it is not important to my analysis of the accident. What is important here are the actions that were taken, not who made them, and a decision-making that occurred. What would you do to survive this partial power accident? It's clear to me that the airplane was in a low energy state. I think the pilot felt the same way and added 10 degrees of flaps to get a little additional lift at the end game. I've done the same in engine out practice to make sure I can make the field. The decision to lower the landing gear was a critical action. I don't believe that this happened on impact. It just doesn't jive with the sequence and the way the damage happened. It was done just as the airplane was approaching the plateau. And if that happened, then the drag imposed by that gear extension in this case took up any margin of energy the pilots had left to clear that obstacle. It was the last of a series of critical actions. I heard in the reports that there was no place to land off the airport at Lake Placid. Looking at the departure end of runway 32, I see lots of trees. And in the approach end of 14, I see some trees, but in both cases, there are roads roughly perpendicular to the runway alignment and very close to the end of the runway. So there are options here, okay? In my view, the roads are viable alternatives as well as the trees. Personally, I would prefer roads, but in a controlled entry into trees at the lowest possible speed, I think would be preferable to a stall spin or an uncontrolled ground impact. From a physics standpoint, a rapid deceleration in the vertical is more survivable than one straight ahead. Okay, your internals don't get dislodged. The trees will absorb some of the energy during the impact sequence, and your best shot at staying alive is a controlled impact at the slowest possible speed. Okay, if it's a clear ground, a road, or trees themselves, okay, controlled at the lowest possible speed. I think this all comes down to a mindset and a healthy grasp of the energy state of the airplane you're flying. Okay, if something fails on the airplane's sole job is to keep me and my passengers alive, and I would hope you feel the same way. If the airplane is not reusable after this event, well, then that's okay. The insurance company bought it. At least I'm alive to tell the story, and that's my goal. Let me repeat this here. Bending the airplane is not a decision factor. Don't spend a second on it because you don't have extra time here. Engine failure after takeoff is a really bad situation. My approach to flying is that something on the airplane can fail at any moment, and my first consideration is the energy state of the airplane. I've had an engine fail just after takeoff, and that has made me keenly aware of my options at whatever airport I'm operating from. I've had several engine failures overall, and approach it from a when, not if perspective. Just after takeoff, your energy bucket is virtually empty, and that's the critical time. I've done several videos on this accident scenario, and my bottom line is that, the impossible turnback scenario is the most dangerous maneuver in general aviation single engine flying. And if you don't practice it, don't even try it. I'm preaching on that one, but if you don't practice it, don't try it at all, period. I also think that it's important that if you do practice it, don't include the landing part. That makes it far more dangerous, runs the risk up exponentially. Just do the turn back, because that's the key learning lesson here. That's much safer. This approach is much safer and will give you that keen edge needed to judge whether or not you have the energy to make the airport area. Okay, it's a dynamic situation, and that's what you have to be able to judge is your energy in a dynamic situation. Are you going to be able to make your plan? More importantly, you must practice it in the airplane you are flying. You've got to know the energy state of that airplane. A Super Cub flies very differently from a relatively heavy Cardinal with a laminar flow wing. You can argue if it's not completely laminar flow, but it's close, and stall is a bad thing in those things, and laminar flows. Different airplanes compound the visual calculus you must solve during a forced landing. It's one of those times where the previous experience in other airplanes could prove fatal in the airplane you're in. Airplanes are not created equal. The important skill needed to make this engine out scenario work successfully is the ability to continually judge energy during the descent. You've got to be able to look out the window and assess whether you're going to have the energy to go where you're planning, or do you need to look for plan B, a closer spot to land on right now. There isn't an app made or an instrument in the cockpit that's going to serve you in the few seconds that you have to make the right choice here. You have to look outside the window. I can't stress that enough. I got to stop my feet on that one. You have to look out the window and be able to assess that energy state. And one more thing, in a retractable gear airplane, I don't put the gear down until I've made the field, period. If I have to land gear up, then that's fine. That's like my Bonanza. It takes 14 seconds for the gear to go down versus the 24-volt airplane in 4 seconds. I'll land gear up. If I have to land gear up, that's okay, even if it's on the runway. Worry tomorrow whether the airplane is reusable or not. Not right now. Getting you and your passengers back on the ground with a low impact is the goal. Unfortunately, in this accident, it appears that the mindset was that the turnback was doable. It looked like that for a time, that it might just work out. I mean, they got within 15 feet of the embankment, right? And then someone made the decision to put the gear down to save the airplane. It's likely that at that point, their fates were sealed. When I run through the accident sequence in this airplane, I think it quite likely that they made it to around 500 feet above the ground before deciding to turn back. The roads and the trees were not even a consideration. I don't see any evidence of that at all. With partial power, this was a critical decision. The energy state was assessed as low, and 10 degrees of flap was added. That's a good decision, but when I run the numbers, I get a wing loading of about 16 for the Cardinal and 9.8 for a Super Cub. That's vastly different performance characteristics that you cannot deny. Given that difference, they almost made it. What works in one airplane will not work in another, okay? And that decision is airplane-centric. I don't care about the airplane, I care about our survival. And if I have to use up the airplane to absorb energy in the impact, that's what I'll do. The ability of an airplane to turn back successfully is dependent on its wing loading and the altitude you are. A heavy airplane burns energy quicker than a light airplane, and just turning burns energy. Without altitude to trade, you have no other choice available. If you roll the dice on making it back to the runway, then you're no longer going to have enough energy to turn to a plan B. So once they've started that turn, they couldn't turn back and hit the road, land on the road instead. My nickel on the grass here is that pick a spot ahead of the wings. Okay? Even in the best of times, the airplane will not perform like you would like it to do. It won't make book numbers for sure. Powered airplanes are poor gliders. Pick your spot and land as slow as you can under control. In an engine failure after takeoff, you don't have time to change your mind. You pretty much have one shot. Choose wisely, and don't worry about the airplane. Stay alive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on FlyWire.